Today, as I mentioned, we are going to address the question of Ireland in the new European economy, and we will do so in a number of ways and from a number of perspectives, both literally and conceptually. One of the things I will do is introduce the panelists who have agreed to join us, and one who is trying to join us from the embassy. On my left is James Lamb, who is president of the Ireland Institute of Pittsburgh and the honorary consul of Ireland in Western Pennsylvania. He is a big supporter of connections with the Irish community, and I've asked him to be our pit person in this conversation. Joining us in Dublin is Vincent Browne, whom I hope you can all see. Vincent is a well-known Irish print and broadcast journalist. He is a columnist with the Irish Times and the Sunday Business Post, and hosts his own television show, Tonight with Vincent Browne. James Donnelly is in Madison, Wisconsin. He is Professor Emeritus of the University of Wisconsin, where he taught history of modern Britain and Ireland, and with a special focus on social history and revolution, which may or may not be appropriate at this time. Joining us also from Dublin is Niamh Hardiman, who is senior lecturer at the School of Politics and International Relations at University College Dublin. And she has recently edited a volume called Irish Governance in Crisis, which tells you something about why we invited her. Buy it! Good, you got your plug. Very good. Very good. Stephen Kinsella is also joining us from Ireland. He is at Limerick, where he is a lecturer of economics at the Kennedy Business School at the University of Limerick. And he, too, has completed a recent work called Understanding Ireland's Economic Crisis, Prospects for Recovery. From Chapel Hill, we have Professor Klaus Larres, who is the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs with the Department of History at UNC Chapel Hill. He himself has also spent time, among other things, in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, and when he was John Monet Professor at Queen's University, and he has held the Henry Kissinger Chair of International Relations and Foreign Policy at the Library of Congress. Those are our panelists. We also have at North Carolina and at American University groups of people, students, others who have joined us, and I want to thank Elizabeth Covington at Wisconsin, Erica Edwards at North Carolina, and Michelle Egan for making their participation possible. I want to thank all of the tech people, except those at the U.S. Embassy who can't seem to figure it out, for making this possible, as well as Allison Delmore, Karen Halton, and Mark Weitzel here at the University of Pittsburgh, who've made this conversation possible. We hope, if technology will allow it, to be joined by the American ambassador to Ireland, Daniel M. Rooney, who has offered to greet us and offer some welcoming remarks, and I will introduce him if he, in fact, can do so. He is intending and hoping to do so, but in the war of men versus machines, machines always win. So we don't know if that will happen. In 1973, when Ireland joined the European Union, it was at that time the poorest country in Western Europe. It was an overly agricultural economy. Its trade was tied to the United Kingdom. It suffered high unemployment and net emigration. By 1999, less than 3 decades within the EU, Ireland was the richest country in Western Europe by per capita measurement. It had an unemployment of 4%. It was the most globalized country according to Foreign Policy's globalization measurements. It was a net recipient of immigration, and its debt to GDP ratio was 26%. Less than a decade later, Ireland was in a recession and then a depression. GDP fell 7% in 2009 and has been flat in nominal terms and declined by 7% in real terms for the last 3 years. The Irish stock index, which at one point had hit 10,000 points, fell to less than 2,000 points 2 years later. Unemployment reached almost 12% in 2009 and nearly 15% this year. Ireland's gross debt as a ratio of a GDP passed 100% in 2011, stimulated by huge bailouts of private banks and guarantees that will cost Ireland $3 billion every year for the next year by recent estimates. Ireland was obliged at that point in 2010 to accept an IMF European Central Bank bailout to the tune of some 85 billion euros, which the government has, of course, in large measure, passed on to the banks. But that has come with the obligation to impose serious budget cuts so that Ireland can meet its target of reducing its budget deficit from 13% to 3%. Such discussions are currently going on, even according to today's Financial Times, about renegotiating either the targets or the terms of the bailout. David Begg, General Secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, said, "We were the poster child for globalization, and now we are the poster child for austerity." The question I have to you panelists is quite simply, what happened? That's only one question. Related to that is the question of, why does it matter? Ireland is a small country. Why should we worry about it? What impact will it have on this recovery on Ireland, on the EU, on Europe, and on relations with the United States? So let me begin by posing this first question. To what extent is the Irish economic crisis homemade? Now, let me say, before you all jump into answer, let me mention a couple of tech things. The way this works is that while your microphones are on, any noise you make or rustling will bring you to the center of our screen, and it works the same way with you. So when you're not speaking, we urge you to mute yourselves, or we will do it for you. However, that of course we want to recognize you, so believe it or not, a simple wave or gesture will indicate that you like to speak. I'll recognize you, and we'll hopefully keep some flow going. I should also remind you, for those of you for whom this matters, that this, through the wonder of technology, this entire conversation is being recorded. We will then post it on our website. The panelists have been sent forms which suggest their permission to have this recorded, and your participation implies your permission to be recorded. So, with that, the floor is open.
I'd be happy to begin.
Please, Professor Donnelly.
You asked the question, to what extent is the Irish catastrophe homegrown? And maybe the best place to begin and the easiest to understand for Americans in particular is the collapse of the Irish housing boom between 2001, the boom that lasted from 2001 to the end of 2007, because the boom had begun earlier. And it was the collapse of this housing boom beginning in September of 2007 and continuing to the present that really brought the whole house of cards down. to give a good idea of the dimensions of this particular bust in the housing boom, one might cite the fact that at the peak in 2007, Ireland was building more than 90,000 new dwellings every year on an annual basis. And the housing boom had been particularly strong in the years since 2001 down into the fall of 2007. Today, or in the year 2011, Ireland is building only about 10,000 new dwellings on an annual basis. So we go from a peak of over 90,000 annually in new dwellings to a current low of about 10,000 new dwellings. The result, of course, was the collapse of both the banking industry and the construction industry. And that collapse has brought about between 2008 and 2011 a contraction of about 12% in Irish gross national product, and a very sharp decline in average wages, a kind of internal devaluation. It has meant that many of the immigrants who poured into Ireland in the late 1990s and the early 2000s have either become unemployed or more likely left the country. And it also means that Ireland has an unemployment rate currently, as you mentioned, pressing on 15%, and is projected to have a similar unemployment rate of approximately 15% in 2013. Currently, the IMF has called upon the European Union to engage in a kind of second bailout of the Irish banks. In other words, to take over the equity stake that the government currently holds in the Irish banking system, because under current conditions, Ireland is actually, the Irish debt is increasing, and the conditions for Ireland obtaining new loans in the open market is deteriorating. So though there are some signs of improvement, some signs of Ireland beginning to put its house back in order, the outlook going into 2014 and 2015 is still very bleak.
Is it fair? Oh, Niamh, Professor Hardiman. I see you.
I'll mute myself. Thanks, Ron. Well, I think I disagree. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Yes. Nobody can disagree with that as an account of of what has happened, but I think it might be useful to look behind these trends a little more deeply, to look at the underlying dynamics of Irish politics and Irish economics that gave rise to these problems. The housing boom was certainly the proximate cause, and the collapse of the boom and the devastation wrought on the banks is certainly the big story in the Irish crisis. But behind that lies, I guess, four things setting out. The first is, just quickly, the changed incentives to Irish government as a consequence of European monetary union. This meant that for the first time, very cheap loans were available in Ireland to private borrowers as well as to government. But it was primarily the private borrowers who availed of these cheap loans, and the continental European free. This is what lies behind the housing. Secondly, what gave rise to the housing itself was a very close connection between builders, property developers and politicians, a kind of crony capitalism, a kind of cement capitalism, concrete capitalism is what we had, which meant that the restraints on an overheated housing market were not put in place. which should have been put in place, were not put in place. The bankers were part of this insider group as well. Very light banking regulation was a matter of policy when it was clear that the banks were becoming overextended, but nobody ever really got to the bottom of it. So when crisis hit, the extent of information that should have been available wasn't there. The third thing is further deficiencies in the institutional apparatus of Irish politics, which meant that fiscal policy got way out of control. It meant that governments never really got the idea that in an upswing, you hold back. In a downturn, you prime the economy. The famous, notorious quote from Finance Minister Charlie McCreevy in the early 2000s was that, when I have it, I spend it. So government was fueling a boom at exactly the wrong moment. And the fourth thing to note is that crisis was not caused by fiscal overspending. The government was able to spend very freely because it had lots of money coming in through a very buoyant tax system at the time. But the crisis revealed that the fiscal strategy was itself based on thin foundations, that there were big holes in the tax system allowed to emerge through a commitment to low taxation, especially on employee, an unwillingness to tax other sources of income, low corporation tax, which is a matter of policy, and an over-reliance on revenues coming from the very buoyant building and housing industry. And this meant that when the crisis hit, the tax revenues plummeted while spending commitments soared. But it was the deficit then as a consequence, not a cause. Fiscal deficit is a consequence, not a cause of the crisis. And behind this crisis, both financial and fiscal, are several deep institutional features, including changes in the European parameters of Irish politics and Irish decision-making. That's it.
That suggests that getting out of the crisis, paying off the debt, is really only dealing with the immediate consequences, but not the underlying structural issues.
That's my suggestion. Yes. That there are domestic things and also European things that need to be considered, teasing out in the conversation.
Professor Larres.
Yeah, I think we all agree that the Irish crisis is both homemade and also a consequence of the global economic and financial crisis. And apart from the housing boom and the property bubble and the banking problems, I think the well-known cozy links between Irish politics and the banks and the construction industry are well known. But let me talk about the consequences, whether Ireland really matters for Europe. And it's a bit like with Greece. As far as European GNP is concerned, then I think, it doesn't really matter if countries like Greece and Ireland have problems, because they do not produce most of the economic GNP and productivity in Europe. However, as far as the European project is concerned, it is of course highly essential that peripheral countries such as Greece and Ireland do well, because the European project is not just about the big three. Originally that was perhaps the case, Franco-German reconciliation after the war, but since then it is really the well-being of the more peripheral, the smaller countries in the EU, including the Eastern European countries, which are really central for the European project. Therefore, if Greece and Ireland go down the drain and cannot recover, I think that would undermine the entire European project, and contagion would of course also go to other bigger countries. Therefore, I believe that Ireland is absolutely essential, and the recovery is absolutely essential for the survival of the European project.
Well,
I am informed that the American ambassador to Ireland is able to join us, not by video. I won't say he's at an undisclosed location, but he's apparently joining us by phone, and I'd like to offer him the opportunity to make some comments. Ambassador Daniel M. Rooney is the United States ambassador to Ireland. He has been this ambassador since 2009. We are very proud of him here in Pittsburgh because, of course, he is a native son born on our north side and educated here and a graduate from Duquesne University. We will forgive him for that. He has been extremely involved in a number of activities in terms of especially charitable events and charitable boards and foundations, though he is probably best known because of his role as leadership of the Pittsburgh Steelers, the American football franchise. In fact, I can say with total confidence that for the first time in the University of Pittsburgh's history, we have an academic contribution from someone who is in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I'd like to offer the podium to Ambassador Rooney, whom we won't be able to see, but hopefully be able to hear.
Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully, I can be heard. It is my pleasure, really, to be on with Pitt. Our relationship with Pitt has been very, very good. We practice at the same facilities, and I've had 3 plus my wife graduates from the university, and Mark Nortenberg is a great friend. First of all, I'd like to say that this is an important day, September 11th. We're all familiar with 9/11, the day that showed the American resilience, especially in New York, who built the plaza, and has shown our courage and commitment, and we stand together against violence and terrorism. I really, what I wanted to do to open this up was to give you 2 thoughts for your deliberation. First, you've already started, and that is Ireland. I don't completely agree with the speaker just before me of comparing Ireland with Greece. It's much different in that the Irish are really trying to be involved and do what is right. They've got their austerity programs, and they're doing they're doing well. I don't want to say very well because they have a lot to come out, and I do agree with him. It's very, very important that Ireland does come out of this thing because it's very important. Ireland and the United States, and I might say Ireland and the British are together, and the relationship is strong, is more strong than it's ever been. And we go back a long way, the United States with Ireland. We were there even before we were countries, and the peace process that the 3 countries, Britain, Ireland, and the United States, did to forge the peace process was very, very vital in today's complex world. Ireland is doing, all right. They are very well received in Europe. They are looked upon as maybe the poster boy because they are trying. And as I say, that's where I differ with the previous speakers of saying that they're compared to Greece. And he's right as far as there's 3 or 4 countries, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and I put Greece completely aside because they're quite different. And I think that Ireland is doing all right in 3 strong areas. Financial institutions are covering from the property, as was said in the banking crisis, which has already been mentioned. I think Ireland is dealing with that as best possible and making some progress. There is also return to the fiscal stability and self-sustaining the budgets. And Ireland's competitiveness is once again a source of economic growth, which is most critical for Ireland to recover and thrive. Ireland has re-entered the money market, getting bonds, and it's being well received. Ireland is especially looked upon to assist with the European leadership. Ireland is scheduled to take over the EU presidency in January, and I believe the economic recovery in the Republic is an excellent fuel for the continued progress that's in the Eurozone. So that is what I said. And the other problem that the other situation that I wanted to mention was the job labor situation, which is very critical in Ireland. Unemployment here is up in the area of 13%, and it's a very difficult thing. It's very difficult in the U.S., where, you know, in the last 20-so months, our unemployment has been 8.1% to 8.3%. And this is something that I think that you could look at. Just, is it possible in today's economy that we have, in the world, is it possible to reduce that number down to 7 or 8? I know that there are people that talk about that it could get to 4, but I think that they're being optimistic. This is something that has to happen in the world for all these countries to do. You know, graduates in science with their math, engineering degrees, they can get a job tomorrow. But what do you see for the liberal arts graduates? What jobs can they acquire? You know, and when you look at these things and you start talking that way, you wonder, you know, is Ireland going to lose its culture, which is a very, very big and important thing for the people, because they are withstanding some of the problems that were mentioned. And I say that this is something that you might look at because, you know, will there be enough work for all the peoples on this planet? I think that's something that we have to say, and we have to question. That is really what I wanted to make as far as my opening, and listen to what you have to say as long as I can. But I really praise you for having this panel, and I think it should be well received. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for joining us, especially today when I know you have a lot of official duties. The comments so far have pointed to the intersection, if I may say as a liberal arts graduate, between economics and politics. And I want to ask, in order, Professor Kinsella, to address the economic question. How is Ireland doing? Some say, we didn't hear it today, their straits are desperate, others say they're doing well. But then I want to also turn to Vincent Browne and ask him to address that political question that Professor Hardiman raised. Is our politics inevitably stuck in that gridlock that will simply get out of this crisis only to lead to another? Professor Kinsella.
Well, I suppose in terms of where Ireland is right now, we have a situation where the level of demand is about 26% below its peak in 2007. We have roughly a 15% unemployment rate.
Too bad you can't hear this.
Go ahead. There's somebody that needs to be muted. I won't identify him.
Okay.
It isn't you.
Wonderful. So we have a 15% unemployment rate. There's a demand problem, but most importantly, there's a debt problem. So Ireland's leverage ratio, or this ratio of household disposable debt, household debt to disposable income, is about twice that of Spain. It's about twice that of the USA. What that means is that if you want to reduce your debt levels, you're going to eat into your disposable income, what you have left over after you pay your mortgage and so on and so forth. That's far too high. It's well over 200%. So this is really, really worrying. The fundamental problem that we have in Ireland right now is a balance sheet problem. There's a mismatch between the value of our assets on one side and the value of our liabilities on the other. That's the fundamental problem. That's causing a credit constraint. It's causing a collapse in consumer confidence. And it also means that we can't really spend our way, in the private sector sense, out of this boondoggle. However, there are some signs, and I've been looking at the data very carefully recently, of that things are stabilizing. So in time series analysis, there's a thing called the head and shoulders effect. So it looks a bit like a heartbeat. It looks like that. So things are going normally, then there's a boom, there's a peak, then it returns to normal. It's a bit like, exactly like a heartbeat. The asystole and systole vibrations of the heart. If you look at retail sales in 2000, they're going like this, then they explode and dip. And in 2012, they're more or less back to their 2002 levels. If you look at total manufacturing output, you get the same head and shoulders type effect. If you look at prices, especially the price of things like food, they're starting to stabilize. So while it's not the case that we have a full recovery, we're starting to see, I think, the seeds of the recovery, where we return essentially to the level of standard of living that we were in the 2000s. That's in the private sector. The problem is that on the other side, we have all of the debt that we've built up during the crisis, and that needs to be paid off. It should also be said that all of this, exactly as Niamh said, began in the private sector. Actually, following 9/11, interest rates were depressed across the entire world to get the world out of the recession caused by the September 11th crash, and that was amplified by the EMU. So, in that sense, it's a private sector problem that has spilled over into the public sector. And so, while all of the efforts that are being made right now to alleviate the debt crisis, while all these efforts are being made right now, really it's the case that the private sector has to get itself out of the mire, and that's what's most difficult. There have been two really important pieces of research done recently. The first is on SME, small and medium enterprise credit conditions, and it's shown that these enterprises, which we would expect to be the engine of job creation, can't get loans, so they can't finance themselves in the future. That's really harming unemployment. The second big piece of research is that household savings are basically all being used to pay down debt as opposed to helping to invest. So these are two really important problems that we have, but now that we understand them, we can make efforts, hopefully through the political system, to change them. I think there's now a pretty good consensus on the diagnosis of the problem. It's a balance sheet problem, and there are pretty good ways to get out of balance sheet recessions. In fact, there's a whole theoretical playbook that you can take from other economies. So hopefully in the next year or two, we'll see policymakers very slowly winding around to that notion that we need to look at the debt levels, especially in households, to really get out of this mess.
Thank you. That provides an excellent segue to Vincent Browne, because we have often seen economic prescriptions, shall we say, founder on the rocks of politics. It's not unknown in the United States. So I'm going to ask Vincent Browne to comment on that as well.
Well, I think that Niamh Hardiman and Stephen are correct in that there was a problem with the property boom. Ireland benefited enormously, or did benefit enormously, from membership of the European Union. However, being a member of a single currency has been problematic for us. This is because, primarily because interest rates were too low and spurred the property boom. When the crisis happened in 2008, there was pressure put on the Irish government at the time to give a bank guarantee, not as extent as it was eventually given, but there was pressure to provide a bank guarantee to ensure that no bank would fail. That, in my view, was a major mistake. That was followed up by coercion on the part of the European Bank on bailing out senior unsecured bondholders who were not guaranteed by the bank guarantee given in September 2008. And the combination of those two things has imposed, as Stephen said, a huge debt burden on the Irish state. The present government, the new government that came into office in March of 2011, promised that they would seek to get an amelioration of that debt burden. There's little evidence that they did not do it, and certainly no evidence that anything has occurred on that score, although there are some indications that something may occur in the next few months, but I wouldn't be at all sure of that. In addition to that, because we were forced into a rescue program in November, December of 2008, we have been forced to apply austerity measures here in this country at the dictate of the Troika, that's the ECB, the European Commission, and the IMF, that has caused great hardship to poorer sections of this society. And the political culture that we have makes such a recourse acceptable, and as a consequence of which we have a great deal of misery and unnecessary misery. What doesn't seem to be appreciated, however, is that in spite of all that's happened, and in spite of the contraction in GDP and GNP, and GNP is the more reliable indicator of what happens here, Ireland is still a very rich country. And the difficulty that we have is that because of our political culture, and a similar political culture in America and in a lot of the Western world, a lot of the world indeed, there is not a willingness to distribute that wealth fairly and reasonably. So the depth of austerity and the depth of misery is partly caused by measures that have been inflicted on us, but largely caused by political choices we've made domestically.
Could I make a couple of points?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Could I make a couple of points in response to what Stephen Kinsella at the University of Limerick had to say? While I would certainly agree that the biggest fiscal problems that Ireland faces are the level of its private debt, mostly as a result of a 50% decline in housing values over the last 5 years, and in the size of its public debt, there's a real question as to whether Ireland, as a small and open economy, can do anything by itself to improve its situation with regard to the level of domestic demand. So really, it would appear that if Ireland is to come out of the economic catastrophe which has befallen it, there needs to be a very considerable improvement in its exports of goods and services to the EU, the Eurozone, and the rest of the world. There's really no way in which Ireland can spend its way into a better demand situation within the country. What it needs to see is a much stronger international demand for what it exports. Ireland is an export-dependent economy, and unless it can find in the outside world a much stronger demand for its exports, its problems of very high public debt and very high private debt are going to be almost impossible to eliminate or even substantially alleviate in the short and the medium term.
Yes. Go ahead.
There are a couple of points there. The first is that Ireland could substantially change the profile of domestic demand in a couple of ways. One of the things that the Troika, are talking about is selling off our state assets. So if this isn't something, by the way, I agree wholeheartedly with, but it's just the first thing that comes into my mind. If we sold, let's say, our energy provider, one of our energy providers, for €5 billion, just say, and we took €2.5 billion of that, and we created an employer of last resort scheme, and we used that money to channel it through to the people who are unemployed right now, in order to achieve socially beneficial projects that might improve the cohesiveness of Irish society and generate a positive multiplier. The latest short-term fiscal multipliers are about 1.23. So if we spend $1 billion, it'll result in a 1.23 billion euro increase in GDP. We're about €7.5 billion off. So you could achieve probably a 3 or 4% increase in GDP simply by doing something like that. They're short-term measures. The other thing is about the composition of exports. It's of course known that Ireland is a massive exporter, but what's less known is just who does this exporting. It's probably closer to the truth to say that we're an export platform for multinational companies, specifically pharmaceutical. So we have about 53% of our exports come just from pharmaceuticals. So asking these guys, and you know, people will always need Viagra, I suppose. But guys, you know, they have results, right? Yeah, they have a certain problem, which is that many of the important drugs that they sell are coming off patent very soon. So that's going to damage the composition of our exports. However, Ireland could actually generate a large amount of demand simply by getting a pretty low interest loan from the European Investment Bank and helping to create some of the release some of the constraints on SMEs who will sell into the international markets and will produce indigenous jobs. I think what's really, really important from the research that I've seen recently is that these guys have jobs. They have jobs and they have customers. These customers are abroad. They can't hire people to service the demand because they have no initial outlay. So there are several complicating factors. It's possible to stimulate demand in a small open economy if you do it carefully. It's also possible to restructure the economy using supply side and demand side measures simultaneously. So one could lower the minimum wage, for example, but doing that, you'd have to be careful not to create poverty traps. You could do it if you're careful. You could also, so you could affect a change in the composition of the factors of production. Don't forget, we sent a lot of young men and women into construction instead of finishing their education, and now they all need to be re-educated. There's a huge market there that these guys all need retraining. We haven't spent that money. We haven't retrained them. Somebody who was made unemployed in 2007 could have a master's degree by now, and we don't see that happening in large measure, which is what's creating the structural problem. So it is of course the case that an international recovery would help us, but it's far more the case that domestic solutions are quicker to implement and also could generate benefits more quickly.
Professor Hardiman.
I agree entirely with what Stephen was saying, but I would like to amplify a little the other side of it. What he's talking about is ways in which domestic demand could be improved and increased. And I think that what he's saying has an awful lot of sense to it. But I would just like to raise a question over the proposal that everybody needs to be export-oriented and improving competitiveness is the way out of recession for Europe in general. And I think that's really problematic. I think that it's as Stephen was pointing out, Ireland is already exporting an enormous amount, but something like 80% of Irish exports come from US multinationals. Don't really have a terrifically well-developed domestic export capacity otherwise, and while the small and medium enterprise sector would or could export credit available to it, it's the stimulation of domestic demand that is really, really important there. It seems to me that though we need to also recognise that there's a very important international dimension potential for Irish recovery in two respects. One is that the whole model of forcing down domestic living standards, in other words, looking for a competitiveness-driven domestic cost adjustment as a means of bootstrapping yourself back into growth, is really problematic. And we see the political limits to that big time in Greece, where they've done a really major amendment, improvement, we could say, consolidation of their fiscal situation, and theirs is a majorly public spending fiscal problem over the last 3 years, but at the cost of enormous social dislocation. Now, that level of social dislocation is not as great in Ireland, but as Vincent Browne has correctly pointed out, there are big distributive problems and an awful lot of human suffering going on as a result of that. So forcing down domestic living standards is always going to be politically problematic. There are limits to it at some point, and this model of achieving adjustment is one that makes sense to a large exporting country like Germany. But it's a truism, not every can be Germany. So at the European level, we really have to ask, where is the growth going to come from? And that really is a question of demand-driven growth coming from the large economy of Germany. The second dimension of European level solution or contribution to Ireland's recovery has to do with a solution to the banking problems. And Stephen is perhaps a bit more pessimistic than the governor of the Irish Central Bank about the prospects of getting a deal from the European decision makers, from the ECB, within some appreciably near period of time on the burden of debt that is loaded onto the Irish taxpayers and the time period within which this needs to be repaid. But getting a deal on the banks and restructuring the loan burden would be really helpful, and that's not something that the Irish institutions can do, or Irish politics can do by itself.
Thank you. A mention of U.S. multinationals reminds me that I have a colleague here in Pittsburgh, James Lamb, the Honorary Consul, who would like to comment.
I would like to get everybody's opinion or comment on what appears to me to be what took place over let's say a 20-year period or a 15-year period from the mid-90s up until about 2002, 2003. It seemed, from where I sat, that Ireland was on a very good growth trajectory. That growth was real. That the economy was competitive, and that it was sustainable. And at some point, when the property bubble developed, and regular citizens of Ireland were really some kind of race to see how much they could sell to their neighbors for. It all started to unwind. Is that, without sounding too simplistic, is that kind of what happened?
Yeah. Well, let me take a stab at answering that particular question. One of the bad things that happened to Ireland in the period between 2000, the year 2000 and 2008, was a very drastic increase in the rate of inflation. So in the period from 2000 to 2008, the overall inflation was about 35%. This, of course, was partly a result of the easy credit for consumer loans and for housing loans, but it meant that Irish industry and, to some extent, Irish services became uncompetitive at the international level. And since Ireland was a member of the Eurozone, the only way in which it could reel back and seek to obtain a more competitive situation is by what is called internal devaluation, which essentially means the depression of Irish average wage rates. So since 2000, in the years between 2008 and 2011, Irish wage rates have been sorely depressed, leading to the problem of a sharp decline in Irish disposable incomes and into the inadequacy of demand. So Ireland's problem has partly been to get back to a situation where its international competitiveness would be something like it was at the outset, or say in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And only that will allow it to see its exports grow again.
Professor Larres.
Yeah, thank you. I thought, and correct me if I'm wrong, I thought that Irish exports still mostly go to Britain. And as long as there is no British recovery and that the British are as downtrodden, their economy at least, as they are, is there really any hope for Irish recovery? You know, despite everything the Irish doing domestically, I wonder whether they are not totally dependent, at least to a large extent, on what is happening in Britain, because British-Irish economic relations are still closely intertwined.
Closely intertwined, but more exports to the Eurozone than to the UK.
Professor Kinsella.
So 2 points. One is exactly to echo the point, we export more to the EU than the UK. The second point is that Britain is blessed, even though their economy's not doing so well, they're blessed with their own currency. One of the things that Ireland has benefited from in the EU IMF bailout has been several billion euros worth of UK loans. So the reason that they do this is because we buy their stuff. In fact, we buy more stuff than Brazil, Russia, and India and China combined from the British. So one way that the UK could directly stimulate our economy is just by giving us more loans. Print off a load of sterling, give us more loans, ask us to pay it back in 50 years, and that could stimulate domestic demand. I'm not being entirely facetious, by the way. Like this is something that could quite possibly happen. In fact, it is happening in a small way because they're directly funding the construction of wind farms in Ireland right now. So it could work. On the competitiveness story, honestly, I'm not sold on the competitiveness story because the truth about competitiveness is it's a horse race. And the nice thing about horse races is you can tell when you're racing two horses that are roughly the same against one another. Ireland in 2000 is a different place to Ireland in 2012. And I'm not sure that we can go back to that economy, quite frankly, saddled with the debt that we have. So the unit labour cost argument doesn't really stand up when you look at it at the data carefully. Basically, what we've done is we've affected a total drop in the wage bill by simply firing 15% of the labour force. It's not the case that the average wage has dropped by that much. So in looking at the unit labour costs and the change in unit labour costs, you don't get the competitiveness story back that you'd like. But I'm not so certain that that's what we need. I think rather than trying to sell stuff from the year 2000, probably what we need to do is figure out how to sell stuff for 2014 today with small and medium enterprises and finance them to do that.
Professor Hardiman.
Yeah, sorry, I was wagging my fingers actually before Stephen made that last point. I think that unit labour costs is really misleading as an indicator of how well an economy is doing. And even more so in Ireland, because like we're all really kind of a bit suspicious of unit labour costs in the way that they're compiled on international measures, because of essentially the Viagra effect that Stephen was talking about. Irish productivity.
Wait, now I'm Mr. Viagra. That's great.
yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. So cut the recording.
We're recording this. Yeah.
Nice. Because Irish productivity is inflated by the pharmaceutical sector and by transfer pricing from the foreign sector, as well as by the very high level of capital production in those sectors. Furthermore, the inflation that James mentioned a moment ago, the rapid rise in inflation in the early 2000s, resulted in, of course, wages struggling up, trying to keep tabs on living on the cost of living. It's not that we were all bathing our feet the whole time while wages went up so rapidly. It's that workers' purchasing power was barely keeping. Well, actually, and that's not true. Living standards did go up. But prices were going up very much more rapidly, coming from other sources, coming, in other words, mainly from the increase in credit and from the boom in asset prices. So labour competitiveness boils down to labour costs is very misleading, and this tends to be a very simplistic indicator. We often get used from the ECB and so on to sort of wag the finger and tell us that we're not being hard enough on ourselves. It's very much easier to either lay people off in the private sector to do cost adjustment by numbers rather than by wages, than it is to get to depress living standards for those at work. Whereas government can make cuts in total expenditure bill, but Vincent's already pointed out that there's a hugely political process goes on in people struggling, trying not to be the ones who end up in this game of pass the parcel. So you get very inequitable effects in the way that spending cuts are imposed on people in the public sector as well. It's a really nasty kind of game to have to play, and. not even necessarily the best way forward for reasons we've been noting.
I know that we have two groups of students here, one at American University and one at the University of North Carolina, as well as other participants. I'd like to give them, if anyone there has a question that they'd like to pose to any of the panelists, I'd like to invite them to do so. I'd ask only that they speak clearly and identify themselves, and not mention Viagra. Sir.
Here at American University. I just have a quick question kind of about the origins of this crisis. Ireland clearly was tied into the global economy, but do the panelists think that Ireland was uniquely situated to kind of fall into this crisis? Or was it kind of the same way?
Did you say Ireland was unique in this crisis? Is that your question?
Was it uniquely situated to fall into the crisis more so than other EU nations?
I see. Yes, Professor Kinsella.
No, is the answer. But excellent question. So I just got back from Iceland yesterday. And Iceland had almost exactly the same problem that Ireland had, which is huge amounts of inflows of foreign capital sitting in an international financial services center to avoid paying tax to America, basically. They used this money, this really cheap credit, to inflate a huge stock market boom as well as a housing boom. There are examples of property market or asset market explosions all over the place, including Portugal and probably in Spain and Italy as well. So I think Ireland's problem and Iceland's problem is that they're small open economies that didn't have the institutional capacity to deal with these incredibly large firms landing hundreds of billions of euros onto them. The Icelandic regulator is 3 people. There's only 320,000 people in Iceland. You know, it's a borough of New York, and there's 3 guys whose entire job was to regulate an entire financial services sector. I'm sure if you scale it up, you have the Irish problem as well. We just simply didn't have the capacity. They didn't know how to regulate these guys, and they were being told by economists that they didn't need to regulate them anyway. So, very good question, but no, there's nothing unique about Ireland at all.
Thank you. Erica. Oh, wait a second. Erica, I couldn't see. I'm sort of blocked from you. Is there anyone in North Carolina who has a question?
Hey.
We have one.
Should I step in front of the camera or what?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Justin Chandler Wilcox. I was wanting to know, with the iPhone being announced tomorrow, is the big thing. Apple is one of the biggest companies that channels all of its European sales through Ireland, I think, because Ireland keeps a very low corporate tax rate, and I think that's something that Ireland has been very adamant about keeping low. I think projecting it like toward the future is something that can see it in the future, but instead of cutting so many public services, why not just raise the corporate tax rate? I think it's something we should discuss.
Did you hear that?
Did my panelists hear that? Anyone want to take a shot at it?
Yeah, so I would take a shot at that. The corporate tax rate currently charged in Ireland for multinational corporations is 12.5% and has been for quite some time. And that 12.5% tax rate for corporations, multinational corporations, was considered to be probably the single most important factor fueling the boom in Ireland between 1993, 1994, and the recession that came around 2001. So there is this question of whether or not that particular corporate tax rate can be maintained. Other European countries, other members of the Euro, are very unhappy with that particular special provision for Ireland because it gives Ireland a special advantage in attracting especially American direct foreign investment, which was the single most important factor in the boom that began in 1993-94. But here in the United States, politically, there has been an increasing question as to whether or not American corporations operating abroad should be allowed the benefit of offshore tax havens like Ireland, which encourage American multinational corporations to invest their money abroad and create jobs abroad rather than here in the United States. So there is some, both on the European side, among other members of the EU, as well as here in the United States, increasing sentiment going against that special offshore corporate tax haven that Ireland has become because of the low corporate income tax rate of 12.5%.
I'd like to serve my own profession for a moment and move us a little more into politics. We've heard a very dense discussion about the economics of the Irish crisis, and it's been very instructive. What I would invite the panelists to comment on are the political consequences. Ireland typically has been a country that is generally considered to have among the most favorable ratings towards the EU. But it also is the country which rejected, of course, the Nice Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty. My question is, given that several people mentioned the inflow of low interest rates, common currency, and of the euro and the impact of the EU, has any of this had an impact on Irish attitudes towards the EU in particular, or in general, or Irish membership? Professor Hardiman.
Well, several people have mentioned already that Ireland has done extremely well from EU membership, and we must never forget that, and Irish voters in general know that. The whole political modernisation of Ireland progressed very rapidly from the 70s through to the present time within the context of the EU, and Irish administrative structures adapted very successfully to incentives created by EU membership. The creation of the completion of the single market in 1992 was the single biggest factor that led to the takeoff that gave rise to the whole Irish Tiger phase from 1994 to 99 or 2001. This very rapid growth where Ireland got the lion's share of American investment that was at that point sort of footloose and looking for investments in Europe, and low tax, the low tax rate was certainly a part of it, something that I think Irish policymakers would be very reluctant to give up. Discretion over corporation tax is one thing a small open economy likes to have in a situation where you can't do anything about your other costs and your other relative monetary rate. So I think that would be held on to very dearly. So in general, Ireland has done very, very well from the EU. And even in the current crisis, I think that there's a tremendous amount of, discontent about the terms on which the Troika is operating, the terms on which the loan agreement is operating, and the hardships that people are feeling as a consequence. Some people are feeling, not everyone, very unevenly spread. So there's an element of an anti-EU sentiment creeping in here, but at the same time, realistically, there's I think a widespread acknowledgement that the flow of funds from the ECB is in fact what's keeping the banking sector afloat. That the loans from provided within the loan agreement are what makes it possible for the enormous deficit, 18 to 20 billion a year gap between revenues and expenditure, is being met, so that keeping our schools open and our street lights on is a function of being part of this whole system. So I think that when it comes to something like voting on the fiscal treaty most recently, which did pass by a narrow majority, what we find is that there were two levels of debate. One domestic, which is kind of fury about what happened, and a kind of there's always a kind of keenness to kick the government in the shins. So a lot of voting in these second order elections really has more to say about domestic politics than about the EU. But on the other hand, when it really matters, when it's really put up to people, that your future in the EU is on the line here. Really think hard about what the terms of engagement are going to be with the EU. People really gritted their teeth about their anger about austerity and hardships and the domestic politics that gave rise to it, and voted in favour of the fiscal treaty. So public opinion, general sort of support for the EU is sliding in Ireland, definitely, because it is always going to be correlated to a degree with how well off people are feeling. I think the level of EU identity or European citizenship over and above national citizenship is often exaggerated. People don't really feel European in that sense. But I think that there is a very strong, realistic understanding that that Ireland's best interests are served by staying within the Eurozone, doing what's required, gritting the teeth, better within some reasonable period of time.
Vincent.
Just a few points. You mentioned that the Irish electorate voted against the Nice Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty, and that's true, but in subsequent referenda they voted in favour of them. But it's not appreciated abroad, I think, adequately, that Ireland is one of the few countries in Europe where there's ever a referendum on these huge constitutional changes to the European Union itself. And it's widely appreciated in Europe that if, for instance, there were referenda in France, in Holland, in Spain, Germany and elsewhere, many other countries, many other electorates would vote against EU treaties. The fact that Ireland has voted against them is hardly surprising, but then again, Ireland has been pushed into holding a second referendum on these issues and then has voted in favour. And voted in favour of these treaties largely because of bogus threats made to us that if we don't vote in favour of these treaties, we'll be ostracised and put out of the EU, which of course is false. So that's a significant factor. Another factor, just arising from the previous discussion, is to do with our political culture and whether anything has changed. In fact, nothing has changed, though I think you've exaggerated the links between the politics, the banks and developers. I think you've got that slightly wrong. But the parties that are now in office, the Labour Party and Fine Gael, criticised the previous government over the years, not because of what they were doing was reckless, but because it wasn't reckless enough. That they wanted more stimulus in the economy than the previous government was allowing, and then they're now regularly referred to the terrible mess that they were left with when they came into office. But had the government responded to what they were advocating over the previous 10 years, the mess would be far bigger. So that's another significant factor. And a further point I think is worth making, and it is that one of the reasons for the Irish economic success was because of education. And we had an advantage over other countries on the educational front. Not because education was better, but because those who were leaving the workforce were far less educated than the cohort coming into the workforce year on year, which gave us a competitive advantage, which was crucially responsible for the Celtic Tiger success. And it was because of that education bonus that was built into the Irish system, largely because we had such a bad record in education previously, that it was possible for the Economic and Social Research Institute in 1986 to predict, at the middle of another very tough recession, that in the 1990s there would be a boom period, that there would be significant growth in the Irish economy because of that educational advantage, and that's not adequately appreciated. However, I think that there's reason to be a bit concerned about this now, because although theoretically this education boom ought to continue to exist, because a lot of our best educated people are emigrating, we may have lost that or some of that advantage in future years.
If I could make one or two comments about the impact of the financial crisis on Ireland. If I could just bring our attention for a minute or two to the general election of February 2011, which was for Ireland an historic election in the sense that it was probably the single worst drubbing for a sitting government, the Fianna Fáil government, in the history of the Irish state going back to 1922. In that election in February of 2011, Fianna Fáil managed to lose over 50 seats, going down from 70 seats before the election to only 20 afterward, whereas Fine Gael picked up 25 seats, becoming the largest party in the state for the first time, and Labour came into second place, fairly strongly picking up 17 seats. Now, that election in February of 2011 was in part, at least, a referendum among the Irish electorate on the terms of the European bailout. The electorate was very unhappy with the terms of the European bailout that the Fianna Fáil government had initiated the agreement to. Now, admittedly, the electorate was also punishing Fianna Fáil for the policies that had led to the collapse of the banking and the construction industries. But I must say that the voice or the verdict given by the Irish electorate in February of 2011 certainly represented an outcry against the terms of the bailout of 2010.
Vincent? Yes. The contention that there's been a seismic shift in the Irish political culture because represented in the 2011 election is true, but only in a superficial sense, in that one of the main political parties, namely Fianna Fáil, lost a huge number of seats and a huge number of votes. But the same political culture infects the parties now in government. It's the same thing. It's as I made, the point I made before was that the present parties supported the policies that got us into the trouble, and insofar as they were critical of those policies, it was that those policies didn't go far enough. So we have not had a change of political culture at all. One of the disappointing things, I think, was that there was an expectation on the part of many of us that this crisis would result in some fundamental changes in Irish society, that people would perceive the old ways of doing things, that this neoliberal model, which we took from America and took from Europe and Britain, wasn't working. And we would thought that there would be a shift in policy away from that. In fact, it is that those policies have been more embedded into our system than was the case previously. So we're not alone. Did we not learn any lessons? We're going the way that we went previously, and not with regard to the banking crisis, not with regard to the financial institutions, because they're almost defunct, but with regard to economic policy generally and social policy.
Well, we began this discussion when Professor Hardiman first mentioned crony capitalism and institutions that produced what we might call a structural situation. And in a way, Vincent Browne's final comments seem to suggest that that is true and will continue regardless of who is in power.
I didn't say that. I didn't go along with the crony capitalism idea. I don't go along with the idea that there was a bit of crony capitalism, of course, but I don't go along with the idea that our troubles originated from a conjunction of politics with the banks and with the developers. I think that's there was a bit of that, but it's not a significant factor. The major factor was that the major mistake was joining the European single currency arena at all. That if we remained outside of that, we could have avoided a lot of these catastrophes. And when we got into trouble, we could have dealt with it through devaluations or whatever. And I think the crony capitalism idea is a distortion.
Professor Hardiman.
Well, I disagree with that, because I think that crony capitalism intensified what Fianna Fáil was up to anyway. But Vincent is right that, you know, one right-wing party was replaced by another right-wing party with a centre-left add-on, which has made relatively little impact on the overall thrust of economic policy, partly, but only partly because of the very tight constraints that they're under from the terms of the loan agreement. And, you know, Stephen's been pointing out some of the creative things that they could be doing, and the things that we could and should be doing in the labour market and in education that we're not doing, or perhaps discussion is only starting to happen about them now. What I wanted to do was to maybe just flag again this issue about institutional weaknesses. Institutional weaknesses. The ongoing need for institutional political reform in Ireland. Perhaps in the sort of wider comparative political world, people don't realise how extraordinarily powerful any Irish government is. So these embedded sort of cultures of populism and localism have very little counterbalance. Everybody deplores it when they're in opposition. Then they get into power themselves, and of course they don't want to trammel themselves. They don't want to put the restraints on themselves. But there is a huge and well-recognised need to rebalance to have some sort of balance of power in politics, to have a lot more power of scrutiny and oversight of critical analysis of policy on the part of the opposition and of backbenchers more generally, informed policy debate, actual constraints, formal constraints on what governments can do in engaging in reckless fiscal policy. And if this had been in place much earlier, then the kind of incentives to play electoral gambling, electoral casino politics that Vincent has noted, you know, would have been much less, and might have been a better informed policy debate during the 2000s.
Speaking of restraints, it is my unhappy duty, just when it's getting good, to bring our discussions to a halt in deference to our other lives, sad as we are to resume those. I can only say that we will, speaking of resume, that perhaps we will pick this up again in a year, and I do want to end with my sincere thanks to Professor Hardiman, Professor Kinsella, to Vincent Browne, Professor Larres of North Carolina, Professor Donnelly of Wisconsin, to the students at American in North Carolina, to my colleague Jim Lamb, and to the staff who made this possible, this good discussion, excellent discussion possible. We have recorded it, we hope, and we will carefully edit out the mentions of Viagra and then put it up on the web. So my sincere thanks to you all.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ron.
Bye.
Thank you.